Okay, if I could have your attention, please. I'm David Shaw. I'm acting head of the Institute for Biomedical Ethics here at the University of Basel. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Charlotte Blattner, who's an expert in law and is currently, I believe, studying for a PhD in animal law at the University of Basel. And she's going to talk to us today and hopefully lead a discussion on the 3 R's for farmed animals. Maybe you want to say a bit more about your background?
Sure. Thank you so much for the introduction. As mentioned, I studied law in Basel and I'm currently enrolled for a PhD program that Kirsten is participating in too. We're all researching on topics that are quite different from one another, so it might be criminal animal law. I'm researching at the intersection of animal law and public international law. Other people are focusing on procedural aspects, so how to represent animals' interests in a legal procedure in a best way. So that's the background of my work, and today I would like to introduce you an article, a larger article that I've authored. It's called 3R for Farmed Animals. So here's the agenda for today. I would like to examine with you the reasons for a better regulation of farming. We will first elucidate or look at the free market principle, which is a rather economic domain. Then go right into what 3R in research actually means and entails. So we look at its content, its consequences, and its successes. Then, and this is actually the core of today's talk, I would like to show you a possibility of applying 3R to farmed animals. And finally, not less important, I would like to exemplify what it actually means. I would like to illustrate what it means to apply 3R in this sector of farming. So, before we start, a few clarifications are necessary. The arguments that I endorse are legal arguments. They draw on existing legal documents that are in force right now. If I talk about animals, or animal in general, this will be open to the definition of society, which is susceptible to changes and not confined to vertebrates only. But, of course, I will focus on farmed animals. Now, the crucial question to begin with is the question of why should we even aspire to ameliorate the situation of farmed animals? It has been said, especially in societal disciplines, in social disciplines, that there has been an animal turn. So we've gained increased biological knowledge about how animals function, about their sentience, etc. This has entailed an ethical debate about how we should treat them and how much freedom they should be accorded. We've had much more access to information through media democratization, so Facebook, YouTube, etc., which has led to an increased awareness of what is going on with farmed animals. And finally, the question for me now is, has this led to better protection of farmed animals? Well, polls both by the American Farm Bureau and by the EC on consumer concerns show that 66 to 76% of all people wish for an improvement of the legal regulation of farmed animals. However, when looking at a translation into behavior, it's not taking place. So there's no direct translation of the people's aspiration in the regulation of farmed animals to their consuming behavior. And thus the question should be, does this a contrario mean that the choices reflect the social values? And why should the situation even be regulated, therefore? Shouldn't be the principle in dubio pro free market, so that the free market regulates the situation and not the law? Should we therefore even aspire to change something by means of the law? Now, when looking at a free market, animal advocacy says no. The free market principle cannot be applied. unrestrained economic competition will lead to the following situation. The price will be the critical point in food choice of the people, and since low animal welfare is cheapest, the most inhumane conditions for animals will prevail. Evans, for example, says, well, the major objection to such a system is that those parts of society that cannot express their interests monetarily, including non-human animals, are entirely ignored. Also, Mickey Mann states, the wealth maximization standard in general disregards all human valuations or motivations that are not responsive to considerations of price or cost in a sense of being approximately measurable by methods available to economic science. On the other hand, there are scientists like Richard Posner that state, well, no, the free market is actually able to respond to the needs of the animals. So as humans' concern for animals increase, they will increasingly buy products that endorse animal welfare. The demand will rise for these products and the price will go down, will decrease. And therefore there will be an automatic resolution, a resolving of the problem in an automatic sense. But what this critically disregards is that these distributive considerations, this direct translation of human concerns to the market is only able if they are comprehensively reflected therein. So if there is so-called a perfect market, if there is no market distortion. And therefore the question is, what is a market distortion or a market failure? In economics, generally one says there are 4 different groups or possibilities of a market failure, and whenever just one is present, there is a market failure. The free market principle cannot be applied and regulatory intervention is required. So the 4 market failures are externality, monopoly, information asymmetry, and public goods. So an externality means if there is an initial transaction between 2 parties, there is a spillover effect on a third party, whether negative or positive. A monopoly means that there is a single supplier on the market that dominates 25% of the market. Information asymmetry, I think that's very clear. It's basically that the parties involved do not have the same status of information. There is an imbalance of power. And finally, public goods, it's not applicable to our case, but it's just about non-rivalrous consumption and excludability. So let's apply these market failures to the case of farmed animals, right? In the domain of farmed animals, animals are the third party of an initial transaction that experience negative spillover effects. So the initial transaction is between 2 humans, a buyer and a seller, and there are tremendous negative effects experienced by the animals. So that's a spillover effect, an externality. Looking at monopoly, I think especially in the US that's very palpable. 2% of the livestock farms in the US raise 40% of all animals. So that clearly constitutes a monopoly within that meaning. And information asymmetry is also present because there is I think, general a consent that there is a concealment in the animal industry of what is going on in the institutions that raise animals, feed animals, or slaughter animals. Again, that is very palpable in the US. They have introduced laws that make it illegal for anybody to step onto private grounds to take pictures of of the conditions of animals. It's called the Ag law. So you're basically even a terrorist if you take a picture of a cow in a meadow. So we'd only need one of these market failures in order for there to be a non-applicability of the free market principles. But we basically have, therefore, a market failure. Therefore, the free market principle is inadequate and regulatory intervention by means of law is appropriate, justified, and required. And now, stepping right into the topic, how should therefore farmed animals best be regulated? I would say there are many approaches to doing so. What I would like to focus on today is 3R. 3R in research has been established in research, and it's the common legal maxim for regulating animal welfare in research. So by research, I mean foundational and applied research, basically anything that has a potential to impact animal welfare in terms of research. So within the meaning of Article 3 of the Swiss Federal Animal Welfare Act, that would entail many points. So, for example, testing a scientific assumption, observing the effect of a particular measure in the animal, testing a substance, obtaining or testing cells, organs, or bodily fluids, obtaining or replicating organisms alien to the species, or teaching and training. Now, 3R have been developed in 1959 by psychologist Russell and microbiologist Birch. They have been established to evaluate the degree of humaneness of animal treatment in research. As it indicates, 3R is made up of 3 Rs, very simple, of refinement, reduction, and replacement. By refinement, we mean humanitarian approaches that aspire to decrease the incidence and severity of research. So it comprises improvements of accommodation and living conditions, breeding, care, the diminution of fear, distress, and suffering. The second principle is reduction, so it mandates the use of the smallest number of animals while achieving high quality results. Finally, replacement states that the use of animals shall be challenged whenever feasible alternatives exist. I gave you an article to read by John Vorsky. It's not very scientific, but this is actually an article that shows very palpably how specifically 3R could be applied in practice. So replacement by 2D tissue cells or by computer models, etc. Now, what about 3R successes? In a legal sense, 3R had a sweeping popularity. They experienced sweeping popularity. So on a national level, many countries accept it. On an international level, or most of the countries accept it. On an international level, the World Organization for Animal Health, which carries animal welfare as its mandate since 2005, explicitly recognizes 3R. Also, the Basel Declaration, which is one of the most important declarations when it comes to researching animals, accepts it, and the European Convention for the Protection of Vertebrate Animals used for experimental and other scientific purposes. There has been centers for validation of alternatives have been established to validate the alternatives to the use of animals. So it's all nice to hear about the legal recognitions, right? But did actually something change for the animals? That's an interesting question, I think. So studies suggest that since the 1970s until 2010, the number of animals worldwide has been reduced by 50%. And although one has to admit since 2010 or even before there has been a renewed upshot due to new technologies like nanotechnology or stem cell research. Nonetheless, I think one can confidently state that there has been a net benefit of 3R in the domain of research. Another question is, well, how are farmed animals regulated? Do they have a similar strict regulation in general? Well, one can state that they have a much lower level of regulation. There are widespread exemptions for farmed animals in animal welfare acts. If there are provisions, they are dominated by sweeping and general statements. There is a high degree of normativity in the legal documents. Very important, they're not accorded 3R protection. What does it mean they're not accorded 3R protection? Let me illustrate that by showing you the European conventions. There's one convention with regard to research animals and one European convention with regard to farmed animals. So the research convention encompasses 38 articles and has a detailed appendix on the use and the care of animals. In its preamble, it states that the use of animals must be justified and can be justified only if there is an overall benefit both for humans and animals. The European Convention for the Protection of Farming, on the other hand, of animals kept for farming purposes, on the other hand, encompasses only 7 articles and a few implementation articles. It does not have a preamble setting priorities, and the same dichotomy is actually reflected in national laws. So there is very clearly a discrimination of farmed animals when compared to research animals. There is lower regulatory density. There is no examination of the minimization of the numbers of animals used, of the minimization of pain intensity and severity experienced by the animals. The substitutability of the animals is not checked at all. There is also no balance of interests applied. No justification in general is needed to use an animal, and alternatives are therefore not fostered, right? Why should that be a problem? Some people might ask, well, the following illustration might show that of all the animals that we use for research and farming put together, 99% of all these animals are farmed animals, and only 1% is constituted by research animals. Translated, that means that we kill 6 million animals every single hour for farming purposes. Therefore, there is a clear legal discrimination. A far larger number of animals is affected with much less specific or even inexistent legislation. The question, therefore, is why is there illegal discrimination, and is it justifiable? In order to answer this question, we have to go a step back in time, and we have to ask ourselves, well, why were 3R introduced in the first place in research? When looking at the publications of Russell and Burge, one easily comes to the solution that they even explicitly stated that they have introduced or proposed 3R because of the high number of animals affected and because of the severity of stress suffered by animals. They explicitly stated that this is a humanitarian problem. The same is actually supported by the European Convention with regard to research. It states that man has a moral obligation to respect all animals and to have due consideration for their capacity of suffering and memory. Thus, one can say, well, therefore 3R have been introduced because of animal sentience. And what do we mean by sentience, therefore? I would say that the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness gives some good directive explanation to what sentience might be. The Cambridge Declaration has been formed by a prominent international group of cognitive neuroscientists, neuropharmacologists, neurophysiologists, neuroanatomists, and computational neuroscientists. They gathered at the University of Cambridge to reassess the neurobiological substrates of conscious experience and related behaviors in human and non-human animals in 2012. So they, among others, stated that wherever in the brain one evokes instinctual emotional behaviors in non-human animals, many of the ensuing behaviors are consistent with experienced feeling of states, including those internal states that are rewarding and punishing. And by that, they came to the conclusion that the absence of a neurocortex does not appear to preclude an organism from experiencing affective state. Convergent evidence indicates that non-human animals have the neuroanatomical, neurochemical, and neurophysiological substrates of conscious states, along with the capacity to exhibit intentional behaviors. Consequently, the weight of evidence indicates that humans are not unique in possessing neurological substrates that generate consciousness. Sentience, therefore, is one of the most basic way of defining consciousness. It is the ability of an entity to have subjective experiences, so the ability to feel both pleasure and pain. This is also reflected in Article 2 of the Swiss Federal Animal Welfare Act. It states that the Act applies to vertebrates, but the Federal Council decides to which invertebrate it might also apply. And in doing so, it states it is guided by scientific knowledge on the sensitivity of invertebrate animals. And by sensitivity, we mean sensitivity to stimuli that create pleasure and pain, so sentience, therefore. So this could be actually expressed in an illustrative way. So in 3R, in research, 3R has been introduced for the following reasons. If there is X, a sentient being, a living being, plus S, which is sentient, equals 3R, it will be accorded the protection of 3R. So a living being, if it is sentient, has 3R protection. Now what about farming? Farm animals are living beings. They are sentient and therefore should be accorded the application of 3R. Now are there other reasons beside X plus S equals 3R that mandate the extension of 3R to farm animals? I would say yes, and I would say there are even more compelling reasons. There is a principle of the avoidance of unnecessary animal suffering, which states that no animal shall endure unnecessary animal suffering. It is in the legislations of the EU, and it is in the treaties of the Council of Europe. It is explicitly accepted in the legislations of Austria, Australia, Canada, France, Germany, India, Israel, Norway, the Philippines, South Africa, Sweden, Switzerland, the UK, the US, and many more. It therefore has been argued, especially by Catherine Sykes, who has authored a very impressive thesis on the principle of the avoidance of unnecessary animal suffering, that it has amounted to an international policy. And this international policy of the avoidance of unnecessary animal suffering draws no distinction between research animals and farm animals, right? A contrario, one could argue, therefore, there is a corollary legal duty to reduce unnecessary animal suffering, especially also in farming. This is also reflected in Article 4 of the Swiss Federal Animal Welfare Act. So it states, no one may inflict pain, suffering, or harm on an animal, induce anxiety in an animal, or disregard its dignity in any other way without justification. So our intermediate conclusion is, there is a discrimination, and it is not justified due to X plus S equals 3R and the principle of the avoidance of unnecessary animal suffering. Thus, an extension of 3R to farmed animals suggests itself. Now let's look at what the application in a practical sense of 3R to farmed animals would actually entail. So, in terms of refinement, reduction, and replacement. What would refinement in farming look like? It would basically include all the measures that ameliorate prevalent conditions that decrease the severity experienced by animals. I wrote a lengthy article on that, comparing US and Swiss laws, but ideally one can state it's about encompassing provisions that allow the exhibition of natural behavior, providing adequate food, water, and shelter, maintaining social relations between the animals, that branding, docking, debeaking, and teeth cutting shall be prohibited, that antibiotics and hormones shall not be used for growth stimulation, that the use of analgesia and anesthetics is required if the animal needs it, that animals shall be rendered insensible before slaughter, and all of these provisions should also apply to birds. Now, why should refinement not be enough, right? Just refine the conditions of the farm animal and then we're well off. Well, first of all, I think you all heard this in Livia's talk last week. There has been a tremendous increase of animal products and animal production within the last 50 years. The hidden costs are that the price extremely goes down due to the high demand, and there are tremendous subsidies for the animal industry, not only for the production of animals and the slaughter, but for the import feed as well. And therefore the price is not accurately reflected. We're not accurately paying the price that animal products actually cost. Also, it destroys cereal prices and it depletes grain for the direct consumption by the people. So I've just read a study that 95% of all the feed imports of soy in Switzerland are used for animal food. Yeah. Also, it leaves a huge ecological footprint. It uses 70% of the world's water, 38% of the world's land, and 90% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. This falls disproportionately on the poor. It is said that there will be a doubling of the poor in sub-Saharan Africa by 2050. Also, last but not least, it falls disproportionately badly on the animals. Animals are now produced within 50% of the time that they were produced in 1950, which has tremendous consequences for the animals themselves. I also gave you a part of an article describing the conditions of animals, especially in concentrated, in CAFOs, in concentrated feeding organizations. So let's draw an analogy from research. In research, it is accepted to reduce the number of animals as long as we can maintain high quality results. So therefore, also in farming, as long as we can maintain high quality food and clothing, we should reduce the number of animals, right? Right now, we have readily available healthy alternatives to the use of animals, and they're reasonably possible to use. Therefore, reduction is mandated. Now, why should refinement and reduction not be enough? I would like to illustrate that by applying the principle of proportionality. The principle of proportionality is an extremely general principle in law, and it applies whenever two divergent interests clash. It is not only a Western European concept, but it's basically like a global constitutionalism. It is also accepted by the International Court of Justice and by the dispute settlement bodies of the World Trade Organization. So, the principle of proportionality has three constituents. That is, suitability, necessity, and proportionality stricto sensu. In order for a measure to be proportional, all of the three constituents need to be present. So let's look at suitability. Suitability demands that the measure is appropriate to achieve the ends desired. Let's apply this to farming. I think it's arguable whether the use of a sentient being for convenience, convention, or amusement is appropriate to meet the ends of being well-fed and having good clothes. I think that's a very subjective judgment. Therefore, let's leave this point open. We don't know, right? Let's look at necessity, therefore. Necessity demands the use of the mildest means, meaning that there is no less onerous way of achieving the end. In farming, that means animals are not imperatively needed for a human diet. Also, animal consumption is increasingly considered detrimental to human health. Vegetarianism, on the other hand, is healthy for all life phases, and if one could not skip eating meat, we should very much enforce the development of in vitro meat, for example, which does not have such a huge ecological footprint, and it doesn't entail a large-scale suffering of animals. Therefore, necessity, which is commonly known as the principle of proportionality, is not evaluated dependent on social conventions, but it pays deference to readily available alternatives. So the current use of animals causes unnecessary pain and suffering. And you might think that's a very drastic and radical result, right? But on the other hand, unlike the alternative, it doesn't require the killing of a sentient being beforehand. Let's also draw an analogy from research here. In research, it is accepted to replace potentially life-saving research. And if that is accepted in research, then farming actually has a far weaker demand, right? It demands to substitute the use of animals by better, healthier, and less intruding alternatives. So the measure is not necessary. Let's look at proportionality stricto sensu. This sub-principle demands a diligent balance of the interest affected by the act at hand. So no automatic trumping should be allowed. For example, in the German and Austrian Animal Welfare Act, it is demanded that to use or kill an animal, you have to have a good reason. So not every reason is allowed to kill or use an animal. And the same is actually reflected in the Swiss laws, which required a justification. Therefore, a sensible balance of interests, of human and animal interests, is required. Let's apply this balance. So let's look at the downsides. I think it's very clear. If we replace the use of animals in farming, there is a clear restriction of choice and consumption of the people. That's very clear. But on the other hand, this harm experienced by the animals, by the humans, is prima facie not even comparable to the harms experienced by the animals by providing these products. Our use of the animals is easily remunerable. It creates both benefits, also benefits for the environment and for reasons of sustainability. For the public health, it is a great step towards direction of world food security, which pays deference to a kind of justice that we might owe to developing countries for them to be able to have enough food. And last but not least, for reasons of animal welfare. So the measure is not proportional, stricto sensu. And the result is the current use of the animals is not proportional, and therefore replacement should be required. And now my argument is, well, if the absolute replacement is the accepted imperative in research, there should be an even stronger imperative for the replacement in farming. Why so, you might ask? I would like to illustrate that by looking at how we usually illustrate human rights or human interests. So humans have core interests. So for example, our interest in living, our right to life is a core interest, because it's also the precondition, the prerequisite for enjoying all other rights, right? And then we have a periphery one, which includes rights that are essential for our well-being, so bodily integrity or physical integrity, etc. And finally, the outer periphery 2, includes rights that can be more easily violated. So, for example, the right to free speech. I'm not saying that there's a right to consume animal products, but for this argument, let's use it as such. So let's generally compare these different cores of those rights. So we have the core, which apparently weighs much heavier than the periphery 2. So the right in life, the right to live, is much more important than the right to free speech, isn't it? So the right to life is also more important than culinary pleasure. Now 3R accepts that we can replace potentially life-saving research with alternatives that do not use animals. So 3R applies in the core area of our interests. It applies in that area which is most important to us. It's our life, right? So it weighs so heavy that it applies in this area. And now recalling that the core is much heavier than the periphery 2, so our right to life is much more important than having culinary pleasure, let's put this periphery, let's put culinary pleasure on the same scale, in this balance. And we'll see, well, 3R weighs even heavier in that domain and therefore should be applied even more vigorously. Let's also look at the practical application of all of these principles. Between 2002 and 2003, there has been a groundbreaking decision by the highest court of Israel in the case called Noah versus the Attorney General. They've assessed the use of, or the production of foie gras in Israel, which was the fourth largest industry in that country. They applied the principle of proportionality, and they came to the conclusion that the production of foie gras needs to be banned. In specific, they stated gastronomic pleasure cannot justify the pain inflicted upon the geese by physical injury or by violent intrusion into their bodies. The same was actually applied by the US Congress when it banned horse slaughter in 2007. The Illinois Court of Appeal stated, "A state is permitted within reason to express disgust at what people do with the dead, whether that human beings or that animal beings." Although one has to state that the ban was reversed a few years later because all of the horses were exported to Mexico, and the US deemed it a problem and stated that they are afraid that the conditions in Mexico will even be worse than in the US, so they were forced to reverse that ban. Now let's come to the conclusion. We saw that 3R is mandated to be applied in farming because of X plus S equals 3R, because of the principle of the avoidance of unnecessary animal suffering. The consequences therefrom are: refinement is absolutely required, reduction is also required because of its global ramifications, and finally also replacement is required because there are demonstrably healthy alternatives that do not unduly encroach upon humans' choices, and the animal's interest in being alive weighs heavier than the human interest in having culinary pleasure. The principle of the avoidance of unnecessary animal suffering, which is enshrined in all of our legal orders, should not be a paradigm for utopia, but a meaningful short and long-term full goal. So the next short-term goal should actually be the fostering of the alternatives to use of animals. In the Swiss Federal Animal Welfare Act, there is a provision, Article 22, paragraph 2, which states that the alternatives to research shall be fostered. So it's stated, in collaboration with universities and industry, the federal government in particular promotes the development, accreditation and application of methods which replace animal experiments, which enable fewer animals to be used, or which result in less strain for the animals. In particular, it promotes research projects aimed at eliminating pain, suffering, or anxiety in surgical procedures as defined in Article 16. And now, as we've seen through the application or the acceptance that all living beings that are sentient should be accorded 3R protection, and through the application of the overarching principle of the avoidance of unnecessary animal suffering, the same should actually apply to farming sector. And therefore, analogously, vegetarian alternatives should be fostered, and even more so because they are more easily available than alternatives to research, right? Also, product engineering should therefore be fostered, and very important, there should be a relocation of subsidies towards fostering alternatives to use of animals in farming. The benefits of applying these conclusions, the benefits of aspiring these goals would be to master our recognition of animal sentience, to live up to the avowal, to the legal avowal, to avoid unnecessary animal suffering, and finally, to pay full regard to our changing societal beliefs. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm very curious about our discussion. Thank you.